Posted by you/JustAgiolove. Serious, what was your creepy, unexplainable story as a child that was confirmed by your parents to have happened? In the house I grew up in, every night at around midnight these big loud footsteps would go stomping up and down the hallway a few times. I'd often think it was my dad getting up in the night, so sometimes I would stick my head out in the hall to see him, but there was no one there and I'd hear him snoring in his room. This isn't a particularly creepy story, but it's just strange that everyone confirms they heard these footsteps and no one was ever that bothered by it. It's like it happened for as long as we could remember, so we just accepted it. I'm not 100% sure this fits because my mom confirmed it years ago, then denied it when I asked her again a couple months ago, but here it is. When I was little, my dresser, it was long but pretty short, sat against the wall with one of the ends pointed to my door. That dresser is heavy, an old wood one with all sorts of kid crap neatly arranged on top. Since it was in my bedroom, the floor was carpet. I always slept with the door closed. One night, with no explanation, the dresser tipped over. But instead falling forward, it fell 180 degrees to the side, falling in front of my door, all the kid crap spilling to the side. My mom ran to get me, but couldn't open the door as it was being blocked by the dresser. Eventually, with her pushing and me pulling on the dresser, she was able to slip in and move the dresser out of the way. Nothing was damaged, not even the glass figurines I had. My dad helped put it upright the next day and we moved on. Years later, I remembered the incident and asked my mom about it, expecting to learn that I blew it out of proportion and it only fell forward or something like that. Nope, she remembered that night as well. However, she added one detail that I could never figure out. She thought she heard me jumping on the bed that night, and that was why she thought the dresser tipped over. I had been asleep. I have no idea where she heard that noise coming from. My grandmother was a real estate agent in Rhode Island. I was staying with her one summer and she had to take me along to see a potential listing. It was a very strange house because it was circular. All the rooms went along the outside and connected to each other, and there was a center part with a little garden and open to the sky. She went up to the second story and I stayed downstairs because I wanted to walk around the loop one time. The problem started when I had walked a full loop and I didn't see the stairs. I thought I must be confused, so I kept going to the next room and still couldn't find them. My grandmother was a real estate agent in Rhode Island. I was staying with her one summer and she had to take me along to see a potential listing. It was a very strange house because it was circular. All the rooms went along the outside and connected to each other, and there was a center part with a little garden and open to the sky. She went up to the second story and I stayed downstairs because I wanted to walk around the loop one time. The problem started when I had walked a full loop and I didn't see the stairs. I thought I must be confused, so I kept going to the next room and still couldn't find them. Like 15 years later, I brought it up to my mom and asked if she knew anything, or was this a crazy childhood nightmare I'm remembering? She told me she remembered it clearly because my grandmother had called her and was absolutely spooked because she couldn't explain what had happened and she thought she lost me or I had been taken by someone while she was distracted. She had apparently been looking for me for a while. I still don't understand what happened really because the house wasn't even large or confusing to navigate. I still get chills when I think about it. Something very similar happened to me at my great-aunt's place in Canada. It was me, 13 at the time, my parents, grandparents and my 3 siblings staying in her 5-bedroom home. She was there too but was working majority of the time. The house was huge. 3 floors, the basement was its own 2-bedroom apartment huge. The basement was creepy because it was pitch black. She never went down there, so there was no furniture or any signs of life. The center of the house was connected by these spiral stairs that were wide and huge. Her whole house was littered with antique porcelain dolls, which absolutely did not help the creepy cold feel at all. One day everyone went to get some coffee and donuts while my brother, 17, and I stayed back in the house. I was wandering through the ground floor and eventually I went looking for my brother. I went to every room, looking behind the couches and upstairs, yelling and eventually screaming for him. I ran around the outside of the house, and eventually I looked down the big spiral stairs that led into the pitch black basement and went down there while yelling for my brother. As soon as my foot touched the bottom of the stairs to the basement, this absolute feeling of dread and despair hit me like a freight train. I ran upstairs, but just like my nightmares, the stairs kept getting longer and longer. Eventually I made it to the ground floor where my brother looked sweaty and scared to see me. He yelled at me, "Where were you?" Almost the same time I yelled that too. Apparently he went everywhere looking for me. He was sitting on the couch in the living room, which I swore I looked at then he and decided he hasn't seen or heard me for a while, so he went to look around the house for me. He never heard me yell or scream his name, never saw anyone outside or heard any frantic footsteps anywhere. Just pure silence. He got panicked, and the same time he looked at the stairs he sees me running up frantically. I woke up one night when I was 12 because I dreamt that my older brother got into a car accident. I got out of bed and wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get something to drink. My mother was sitting there and asking me why I was awake. I told her I had a bad dream and need something to drink. I got a glass of water when it ringed at our door. My mother went to look who was there in the middle of the night. 2 police officers that asked if they could come inside for a moment. I couldn't hear what they were talking about because I was still in the kitchen and they were in the hallway. After the 2 officers left, my mother came back to the kitchen completely pale and told me that I should go to bed now. I asked her what's wrong when she informed me that my brother was in a car accident and she needs to wake up my dad and go to the hospital now. When I pointed out that this was the bad dream I had before waking up, she only looked at me for a couple of seconds. I prepared myself for comments like "don't be silly and go to bed now," but instead she said "me too." So basically, we both had the same fucking dream of my brother having a car accident. And we both woke up minutes before the police came over to tell us it really happened. My brother survived with some minor injuries, and we've seen the photos of the accident in the newspaper the next day. It looked 100% like in my dream. To the smallest detail. The way he lost control over the car, where it flipped the first time and the tree it came to a stop. Even today my mother and I talk about this. Nobody else believes us when we tell the story. In Mom's seaside hometown, there was an offshore decommissioned lighthouse. Even though utilities to it had long been shut off and the lighthouse was locked, it would randomly light up, clearly visible in all directions. No one could explain it. It happened so infrequently and at odd hours of the night that by the time officials examined the structure, there were no signs of activity. To this day, as I've mentioned here once before, the lighthouse remains mysterious and a bit creepy. When I was 9 or 10, my dad took me to visit with an older hunting buddy friend of his. My parents were divorced and my dad lived in another part of the country, so while I had known this guy since I was a toddler, I didn't share the same common interests as either of them. The older friend was a gun dealer and had lots of catalogs. This was before the internet was in wide use, to order bullets, magazines, guns, etc., and they often spent hours going through listings to determine what they wanted to order. We got there fairly early and my dad said that after an hour or 2 we'd all go to Hardee's for breakfast before going to shoot clay birds. Now I'm a youngin', I don't care much about guns or hunting for sport, and I'm just incredibly bored, so I start wandering around the house, reading my video game magazines that I brought with me, and very quickly that hour or 2 has passed and they're still down there. I ask if they're going to leave any time soon and the friend suggests I check the refrigerator in the kitchen and see if there's anything I want to eat. I look through the fridge and find nothing. However, on the kitchen table I see an apple and decide that will be appetizing enough to hold me over. As I pick up the apple and prepare to take a bite, at that point his wife steps in and tells me don't eat that. Everything in the bowl is wax. I tell her thank you for warning me and continue to wander around the house burning time until we can get going. Maybe another 30 minutes later I go back to the basement where they're going through catalogs and ask when we are going to Hardee's. My dad's friend asks if I'm still hungry after going through their fridge. I tell him that I was going to eat an apple, but his wife told me it was wax before I made the mistake. Both of them give me a blank stare, and after about 20 seconds of shock my dad explains that his wife recently passed away. I then go back through the house to try to find her to show that they were just joking with me, but sure enough she was nowhere to be found. Roughly 30 years later, before he passed away, my dad still insisted that I must have imagined it. But I didn't. She told me not to eat the wax fruit. At my parents' house I used to hear my mom calling out to me when she didn't, and she confirmed she'd hear me call out to her when I didn't. That was a common occurrence. Also, whenever I'd be alone for a little while, if my mom was late from work or at the grocery store, I'd usually be in the main living room playing N64. I would oftentimes hear loud banging sounds from upstairs as if a heavy piece of furniture tipped over. I'd go check and nothing was out of place. Both my mother and grandmother have confirmed similar experiences when they're alone in the house. There was also the time I was downstairs on my laptop, everyone else was in bed, it was after midnight and I didn't realize just how dark everything had gotten without the lights on. I'm zoned out when I begin to hear what sounds like a murmuring from behind me. Like the low rumble you'd hear at a gathering when people are talking and you can't make out conversation. The hairs on my neck immediately stood up and my body locked up from fear. Tears ran down my face from the physical reaction my body was having. I refused to acknowledge it and kept staring at my laptop screen in silence. It took forever for my body to go back to normal. Some time later I told my mother what happened and it freaked her out because she said she's heard the murmuring as well. I've always hated that house. At my parents' house I used to hear my mom calling out to me when she didn't, and she confirmed she'd hear me call out to her when I didn't. That was a common occurrence. Also, whenever I'd be alone for a little while if my mom was late from work or at the grocery store, I'd usually be in the main living room playing N64. I would oftentimes hear loud banging sounds from upstairs as if a heavy piece of furniture tipped over. I'd go check and nothing was out of place. Both my mother and grandmother have confirmed similar experiences when they're alone in the house. There was also the time I was downstairs on my laptop, everyone else was in bed, it was after midnight and I didn't realize just how dark everything had gotten without the lights on. I'm zoned out when I begin to hear what sounds like a murmuring from behind me. Like the low rumble you'd hear at a gathering when people are talking and you can't make out conversation. The hairs on my neck immediately stood up and my body locked up from fear. Tears ran down my face from the physical reaction my body was having. I refused to acknowledge it and kept staring at my laptop screen in silence. It took forever for my body to go back to normal. Some time later I told my mother what happened and it freaked her out because she said she's heard the murmuring as well. I've always hated that house. I live in Colombia, and my father is a doctor, and while growing up, his main work was as hospital director of the most isolated hospitals in rural areas. The good thing is that you'll get used to weird sounds on the night, and the silent night watchers, mostly old folks, walking around without even a flashlight. Usually most of the hospitals we lived in were new and nice, until we got to an old town at the south of the country that was just partially renewed, and most of the construction was the old public retirement home sanitarium, if you could call it home, with a big part basically destroyed, falling ceilings, broken walls, you get the picture. One of my hobbies was to spend the evening playing domino with the head nurse and the night watchman, and joining them on their night walks. One night I was with Pasquale, walking around one of the old areas, when I felt the urge to look back, and then it was a white-gray shadowy figure in front of a boarded room that honestly always gave me the creeps. I remember holding his hand really hard, and that when he told me just don't look, she loves to scare people, and if you look for too long, it can get inside you. At that point I honestly was more terrified of how calm he was, than the specter itself. The good thing is that I ended up building the courage to walk through a bush area behind the constructions where the ambulances used to park, just to avoid crossing near the damed room.